We're stopping and starting recordings to mark the break between sections of the conference. So welcome everybody to this SF24-22 plenary session. Our topic is solution focus across the boundaries. We have a great lineup of panelists to start a discussion on how does solution focus change, if it changes at all, when the context shifts between, for example, therapy, organizational applications, and the social arena, in each of which you find people who are practicing or saying that they are practicing solution-focused approaches. I'm Paul Z. Jackson, and I'll be hosting the panel, which is going to last for around 45 minutes, finishing at 3:15 UK time today. We're recording the session, as you just heard, and we invite you to join in various ways, with cameras on, if you like, microphones muted for the moment, and please write comments and questions in the chat all the way through. You're seeing that there's already very lively interactions going on in the text, in the chat. So keep that going as well. Our panelists, and I hope you can see them spotlighted in front of you, and delighted to have them all here, are Mark Gardner, Janine Waldman, and John Hendon. And I'm going to start, let's start by asking each of them to say something briefly about their context. So the question is, where do you practice solution focus? Who do you practice it with? What shape does it take? John, would you like to introduce yourself briefly with that as the framing question, please?
Yes, indeed. Well, yes, a number of contexts actually over the last 25 or so years. Began with SF in psychotherapy, and then migrated to performance coaching, organizational consulting, and then team facilitation and training.
And in just a phrase or a sentence, are those all the same, or are there differences with respect to the solution focusedness of them?
I think I always try and maintain a fidelity to the approach, but I think there are differences. Certainly, when working with perhaps friends and family, subtly using the solution-focused approach, I might have to soften the language a bit or change some of the wording. And I think in organizational consulting, very much learning the organization speak, if you like, and the jargon of that particular organizational company is helpful in getting some make it more meaningful for the clients.
That's great. Thank you, John. We'll pick up on some of those subtle distinctions as we go along. Janine, what shape does solution focus take for you? Where do you practice solution focus? Who with?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Hello, everybody as well. So for the last 20 years or so, I predominantly work with organizations, and that is kind of implementing and using SF in a number of ways. And that can be firstly coaching one-to-one, and that will be with managers and leaders. And then secondly, designing and delivering training programs. And that can be explicitly teaching people solutions focus. That might be SF conversations or coaching short or longer programs, or applying solutions focus to specific work-related topics. So that could be career development conversations, giving feedback, building resilience. So actually applied solutions focus to a given topic. And then thirdly, like John, consulting on change projects. And that could be like overhauling a performance review process for a large organization, or facilitating a change project, but also with SF thread through everything, either explicitly or in the way that I'm working.
Okay, thank you. And Mark, where do you practice SF? Who with? What shape does it take for you?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Hello, everybody. Very brief story, late 80s, trained as a person-centered sort of Rogerian counselor in an alcohol and drug substance use service. We heard about solution-focused practice. We as a team found reasons to reject it defensively. 10 years later, I was managing mental health services in the UK, southwest of the UK, for a national charity. We were conducting a kind of culture change program towards progressive thinking in mental health, recovery, it was called. Came across solution focused again, paid proper attention this time, and saw the real fit between the principles of recovery, as it was called in mental health, and solution focused, picked it up and have never let it go since, and have been a trainer in solution focused. And I guess you asked about the difference, Paul. I wouldn't be sure about how to answer that because of kind of using it in everything. And I guess as a therapist, it's a minority of what I do. But an additional area where we utilize solution focused thinking and practice all the time is in our community development work.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that, and again about the differences or the stretches that maybe occur when you go from one context to another. Before we do that, what's the appeal of solution focus as an approach for you across all of the work? We'll go John again to start the round, please.
Well, the appeal, yes. I'm mindful of what Chris said earlier on in the opening plenary. You know, it's sort of so simple, I can do this attitude. And I remember hearing, well, I went to one of Steve DeShaza's 2-day workshops in London. And on the way back, I could just see the limitless applications of this approach in its simplicity. And so the language, the techniques, the fact that it is so simple. Obviously, from a psychology background, I was steeped in jargon over many years. And, you know, I remember in my undergraduate days having a psychology dictionary in one hand and the psychology text in the other, just to try and make some sense of what I was reading. But with solution focus, if it's so simple and understandable for us, it can be made simple and understandable for people on the receiving end. And that has been my experience over the years in a whole range of different contexts. And I think that's the greatest appeal in a nutshell.
So perhaps the simplicity is what helps it to move so easily across the boundaries of different contexts.
Oh, that too. Yes, Paul, for sure.
Janine?
Yeah, I agree. What Chris said really resonated. You know, I think I can do this. And in my life prior to becoming a consultant, I was in-house head of training and development, and I was working all sorts of ways, and I was learning about coaching, and everything was talking about problems and issues. I worked with a lot of engineers, and they like to break things. So, and it was like when I came across solutions focus, everything clicked for me as a coach. It started to make a difference, and it was easy to share with other people. And what I really like about it is it can take 5 minutes to pick up solutions focus, but a lifetime to master it. So it's usable instantly, but always learning, always thinking about new ideas and new applications. And it's kept me engaged, and also the diversity of applications which we're exploring here today.
And Mark, you said your team initially, when you encountered it, found reasons to reject it. What were those reasons, and what was the appeal that overcame those reasons to reject?
Not sure I want to talk too much about the reasons we rejected it, because there's nothing to be proud of, but I think it was a defensiveness, really. We just all been through Rogerian person-centered non-directive counselling training, and here was something that was in some ways quite different and promising things which were quite extraordinary. And I think we were a little bit defensive of our recently acquired professional discipline. I can speak for myself, and that was going on for me. So I'd rather now talk about the appeal, and yeah, a lot of the things one could say, but the thing I'm going to pick out is, I think the whole of my work over 30 plus years, and maybe this is the truth for many of the people here, but working in context of mental health and in community development, worked in residential childcare, adults with learning disabilities, and so on. One has to be so sensitive to implied criticism, the risk of implied criticism of the person. And one of the beauties of solution focused, I think, is that because it doesn't wade into any kind of problem focus, which could be associated with, deficit focus, with blame focus. People are often coming quite shame saturated from their traumatic experiences, for example. I think solution focus is brilliant at minimizing the risk that the worker kind of feeds into that. And because there is no agenda for change, the worker is not coming with any opinion about what the person should be doing. I think that's one of the things that's strong about solution focused in minimizing that risk. I think the other thing I'd just like to say is, in many helping contexts, there's no permission from the person to be exploring deficit. And yet many traditional approaches that I've used, come across, witnessed, do that, I think. And I think it's something there about permission that's particularly significant, maybe interesting to explore.
Yeah, so let's think a bit more about the differences. John, you introduced one nuance of difference at least, which was, I think you called it softening of the language in some contexts as against others. Do you want to develop that a bit and or pick up any other differences across context?
Yes, I spoke of softening the language. I remember when my children were young teenagers and they were having trouble with their homework or something, or there was some difficulty at school, and I would come out with certain solution focused techniques or sentences, which I thought were helpful sentences. And I would get the response, "Dad, you're counseling me again."
Don't try this stuff on us, Dad.
Exactly, yeah. That sort of idea. So I had to sort of change the language slightly and use different words, but in order to get the same, for the technique to have impact and produce results. But the other,
so the technique's the same.
The technique's the same, but but just slightly changing the words so that they didn't pick up and say, this is counselling me again. But the other thing I mentioned also about changing slightly was with organizations, when we're doing organizational consulting or team facilitation, I would always have a long conversation with the customer, whether that be personnel director or whoever had invited me in, and get an understanding of the language that that organization used. And I think that's part of going with the client's language. And with all organizations different, and many organizations I've worked with over time, I've noticed that probably 15 to 20 words, someone's interrupted here, sort of 15 to 20 words were unique to that particular organization. It might be sort of, quality assurance, IPR, differentiation of product, or whatever their terms were. And so therefore using that language when talking about some of their issues, it's a case of, it's like, the principle of using the client language, you make more sense to them. So I think it was incumbent on us as practitioners when working in organizations to understand not only the culture of that organization, but their unique use of language.
Using client language can go across contexts, because whoever the client is, an individual, team, an organization or community, they're going to have client language. Janine, the other two panelists, John and Mark, both were and still are one-to-one therapists and had that training, and solution focus comes from one-to-one therapy in a room. Steve Duchesne, Insoo Kim Berg and colleague tradition. As far as I know, you were not one-to-one therapist. Does that put you at any kind of disadvantage or in a different category when it comes to being a solution-focused practitioner?
Oh, well, no, I'm not a therapist. I'm a coach. So I kind of came into solutions focus on one-to-one work. But I do think it's a different context working in organizations, because the scope, people aren't sitting there coming to therapy or necessarily wanting an hour-long chat or a half-hour chat to solve their problems. You know, people, we've seen this shift from kind of coaching to conversations. People want tools and techniques that will help them make a difference in their jobs. And to me, it's the context that makes that difference. So we can go on, Paul.
I was going to say the context changes the language, the client's language, as John has said. You're now saying it changes the relationship. There are different sorts of expectations for what the structure of a project might look like. It's not going to be a one-to-one hour conversation and then you leave necessarily. And in the expectations of the client as to what you're going to be doing as your part of the project as the practitioner.
Yeah. And, you know, if you think about it, if you're a manager in an organization, think about how many conversations a manager has a day, right? Someone with a direct
16.
report, a performance conversation, maybe they've got to pick someone up or they're in a meeting, and each one of those they can apply solutions focus. And that's exciting. And what I've noticed is that it's the adaptability of the approach. So I spent time with therapists. I confess, I've spent time with therapists, and I've learned some of the best practitioners that we can spend hours analyzing a word or a detail, or what do you want for this session, from this session, after this session. But in organizations, people don't need that much skill. They just pick up a tool and run with it. So we worked with someone and they learned this idea about asking people what they wanted from a meeting. And instead of, when their people came to them to complain, instead of listening to their problems, they just said, so what is it you want from the next 10 minutes? And their people wouldn't say, I want to complain. They'd find something useful to talk about. And then they started coming back. And this guy said he reckoned he saved 7 hours in a day because he simply asked people, or in a week, because he simply asked people what they wanted. And, you know, that's impactful. So I think it's different. It's the application, the diversity, and the in organizations, people are looking for tools they can use either explicitly or implicitly as they go about their days.
Do you want to comment on that, Mark, in how language changes or how the expectations or the nature of the relationship changes when you move from one context to another?
Yeah, it got me thinking about the community work that we do. And particularly, we're interested in asset-based community development, which in terms of its principles, there's I think a strong overlap with solution-focused thinking. Our view and our experience is that a solution-focused practice really enhances ABCD, which is a convenient shorthand, asset-based community development. But one of the things about working in a community context is it's a very interesting area, and I think there merits further study in asset-based community development about how you get started. But we're particularly interested, I'm very inspired by Bob Holman, who was a British, I forget what his sociologist maybe, but he was an academic, and he did some research into what makes a difference in community work and the extent to which it makes a difference if the worker lives in the community in which they're working, and found very strong evidence that it did. And he was living in Bath at the time, and him and his whole family moved to the Easterhouse estate in Glasgow and lived there for the rest of his life. And I was very inspired by that, and have been living for the past 27 years in a poorer community on the west of Plymouth. So it's the community I live in. And it's a community that faces all kinds of struggles, and also it's a strong community. And there's something about how you get started with community work, and asset-based community development is, one of the things that characterizes it is that you don't start with what's wrong here. You start with, you know, what do people like about living around here? What do people do? What would people like to see happening? What would people like to bring to that? So I'm going on a bit there, but just directly to answer your question, Paul, I guess, is maybe the starting dynamic. If I start having conversations with my neighbours have not in any sense come to me saying, oh, will you have a chat with me? So that has an impact on the, you know, that context has an impact on the nature of that conversation.
Yes, and I'll invite Janine to comment on this in a minute. I have a comment on it, on what maybe is another difference, and I'm probably going to put it way too strongly. But if you're working in the way you've just described, it's almost that solution focus has become a way of life for the practitioner, which is very different from I do it because it's my professional technique and it's a good choice for the clients I have.
And it is an interesting one, that, Paul. Janine, if you're happy for me just to respond directly to that. So it's a funny one, isn't it? Because I bet there's a lot of people in this room today would agree that the idea of somehow putting down solution focused thinking and practice at 5 o'clock and getting on with a different kind of way of thinking and different kinds of conversations would be kind of absurd. It doesn't mean, you know, thinking about what John said earlier on, doesn't mean you're going around having therapeutic conversations with everybody all the time, how irritating you would be if you did. However, yes, it's a mindset that does, I think, become a way of life, and I've helpful lens in whatever situation.
Janine.
Actually, I was thinking about the nature of the relationship, Mark, and I was thinking about how it might be different in organizations. And it's that, unlike communities, managers have a vested interest in their people doing a job. They're part of the process. They're not separate to it. They don't do a therapy session and hope the person goes off and does something. I'm not that that's, you know, or a coaching session. So they have a vested interest in what's going on. So we're bringing a different dynamic to that relationship. And that makes it, you know, how do they sit in the conversation and on it as well. So it's just made me think about that difference in the relationship. But equally, the managers we do work with, once they get a grip with it, they do start taking it home. And we start to see systemic change. The organizations start to change through conversation. So there's some similarity there as well.
John.
Yes, I just echo that point that you just made there, Janine, and that is, you know, that people do take it on board in their ordinary lives. When I run 2-day workshops on whatever specialist topic it might be, I begin the second day with something along the lines of, from what you heard and learned about yesterday, and thinking in terms of your particular contexts of how you might apply these techniques, what's better? And people say, oh, well, I practiced it last night at the dinner table. I asked my daughter such and such or I had a phone call from a friend and immediately I asked them such and such a question. So they take it on board, I think. And I'd certainly echo what Mark says. It becomes a way of life, and we don't just switch it off at 5 o'clock. And again, when Mark was talking, I was reminded of how useful SF is in crisis situations. You know, we all find ourselves in crisis situations sometimes in life. And I remember a time when I was at the airport, I met up with a friend and we were going on a mountaineering holiday up in Scotland, and he arrived without his passport. And he needed the passport. He needed photo ID. And so we went up to the cafe and we generated, I think, something like 15 possibilities of how he could get to Scotland. But just generating just a basic solution focused technique of generating possibilities.
Mark?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Janine's point about the vested interest the in the workplace, you know, and how that's a different context from, you know, where the therapeutic context from which solution focused emerges. And just a quick anecdote. we've been doing a lot of work with a local authority adult social care department, attempting a solution-focused culture change, and been going on for 5 years now. And all credit to them for initiating it and sticking with it through thick and thin, and increasingly thinner. So one of their champions is a team manager, and she's been having a big challenge, a performance management challenge with a worker, and came to me to ask for some supervision, solution-focused supervision for her to be a solution-focused manager managing performance. And this has been an issue that's been going on for years. And we did 2 sessions, and after a number of weeks, the news was that the worker had resigned. Now, it's an interesting one. Again, probably you could talk about this for at length, but it seemed from what the manager was saying that there was an agenda that the department had and that the manager had, that this person should be performing better. So in a sense, that was the vested interest. So it wasn't, it wasn't just what the person wanted. The organization had a requirement as well. However, the way this was done, the manager described to me, and I've got a lot of confidence in her, was that this was a good outcome for all, because the way she performance managed this person was, it was clear and it was validating, and it just helped to clarify the situation so that this person arrived at the conclusion, I ain't going to make the grade here. This isn't good for me. I need to be thinking, I want to be thinking about somewhere else in my life. So whilst there's the vested interest for the organization, done well, I think it can help everyone to do their best thinking. That can be, being performance managed out can be a good outcome for all.
Sure. So everyone who's listening to the discussion, things that you may agree with, things you may disagree with, and maybe some questions that you would like to ask to the panelists, either collectively or specifically to one of them. And I'm wondering, panelists, if this is another shift across context that's happened or happening, that if you're in a one-to-one therapy situation, the origin situation, there's a lot of emphasis on the questions that you ask. I wonder if there's a shift to the other things you might say within a conversation, making statements, for example, and perhaps beyond that to things you might do, activities, thinking particularly in organizational work. There's a lot of activity that goes on in any solution-focused session that I'm involved in. Janine, do you want to start on that?
So emphasis on statements, so definitely statements, but I think people like giving compliments, and we know there's much of a discussion about whether people should uncover their own resources or give compliments, absolutely. And small steps, people like to take small actions. Yes, if we're facilitating a group work, we could invite them to do a group future perfect, suppose it's tomorrow, what does good look like? So we are seeing that I think questioning still remains at the core, because even getting people in organizations to ask questions is hugely significant rather than telling people what to do. And then once we've got them to ask questions, it's really changing the nature of the questions that they're asking. So they are actually asking questions about what's wanted, resources, etc. So that in itself is significant. And then, yes, there are many things. So making a statement, this is what I want, giving a compliment, using all the tools in group settings. I've seen management meetings run. What does good look like? Where are we on a scale of 1 to 10? What are we doing well? So there are different ways of using it. Absolutely. I think, yeah.
And John, a shift from the question focus of the origins when you go into a different context?
Yes, I think the questioning is really important still. And I tend to when working with organizations with perhaps team facilitation or performance coaching, I would ask lots and lots of presuppositional questions. And I'm a great believer in the greater use of presuppositional questions trains the brains of the client to think solution rather than problem.
Give us one example for anyone that's not
Yeah, a presuppositional
presuppositional
section.
question.
So at the end, so say it's a team facilitation. By the end of today, when you've got a much clearer idea of how we're going to go forward with this problem, what sort of things would you see? Or what sort of areas do you think you'd be most pleased about?
So we're assuming that progress is going to happen, and we can
Absolutely.
ask about it based on that
Exactly,
assumption.
that inevitability that things are going to improve. But it's interesting, as you're asking that, I was mindful of one organization I work with, which was very problem focused, and their tradition was, or if you like, their theory of change was that you must have a subcommittee to talk about the problem and look at it in great detail. And I remember once doing a team facilitation. It was a film company, and they'd been very troubled with lots of redundancies and cancellations of work, etc. And they all came into this team facilitation, these departmental heads, about 18 of them, all sort of like this, slumped, looking like this, and they were absolutely weighed down with problems. So the first exercise I began with was, what are you most dissatisfied about in the company? And they all brightened up, and we had them in groups of 5, and they brainstormed this session, and I gave them something like 20 minutes for this. And then we had a plenary, and I put it all up on flip chart pads, like this one at the back here. And we had 7 pages of all these complaints. And I said, the purpose of this exercise was to check how good your complaining skills are. But that was really helpful, because they felt that I had them at the back of the room, well, the front of the room, so behind me, for the whole of that one day. And they felt they had been heard, and all their worries and their complaints and dissatisfactions had been acknowledged. And then we got onto solution talk.
So this would be shared in any context, that we're careful not to be problem phobic.
Yes.
People like to be heard, and if the thing they want to be heard about is their complaint or their problem, they can say that. But we're not going to dive in, analyze it, or spend longer than we need
No,
to.
but it's going with the company's theory of change was you had to talk about problems.
So you worked with their
So you worked with that and named all the problems and talked them off from the charts. And then we then moved into solution talk, and what will be our first small step, or what would your best hopes be about this particular issue or that particular issue?
I've also seen, if these are the problems, what is it we want to achieve in relation to each of them, sort of Ben Furman type switch across. Janine, you looked coming in.
Yeah, I was thinking of Ben Furman. I was also thinking about an area where we are moving away from questioning, is the kind of giving of feedback, and we've developed a feedback model that is solutions focused, but people are still telling them or giving feedback. So but a very significant area where they can't just say, what do you think, how are you doing? Where there is that opportunity to actually state to someone what they're doing and what they might like to see instead of the problem, rather than going down that deep hole of criticism.
As Andrew has put in the chat, what do you want instead?
Yeah, it's one of the, and it's yeah,
question.
what do you want? But this is actually what I'd like to see instead. Or you did that really well. This is the impact it had, and it'd be great if you did more of it, or how could you do more of it? So blend, but that's one area where it is definitely an opportunity of over continual questioning.
So what ideas do you have about what Janine has just said? You could call it embodying a solution-focused stance as you interact with whoever the client group might be, given that it is a very problem-saturated world, whether we're dealing with an individual who's distressed by their problems, or a community that's got all kinds of issues that they may not be in any way to blame for, but are living with. How do we best embody, what tips do you have about embodying a solution-focused stance in problem-saturated circumstances?
Okay, a couple of thoughts, and also picking up the previous thing about, I forget exactly how you framed it, but I can remember what my answer is, Paul. So
That would be sufficient.
yeah. In a community work context, absolutely, it's the questions still. It's the fact of asking questions much more than telling people stuff. And yes, what we found is that that really solution-focused questions significantly enhance, for example, asset-based community development processes. They're just such good questions at getting the most out of those kinds of processes. And then I was thinking that in answer to the question you just asked, I was already thinking about a few days ago, I had a conversation with two people who work for an organization, the remit of which is to, I'll try and think of a nice way of putting it, but kind of encourage people in certain areas to be more active. And it's very well meant, and I think it's national, and it's very muddy-headed in my view, because again, coming with an agenda, it's coming with an implied criticism. You should be more active. There's no permission for that, for coming in at all. So I just think when people really grasp solution-focused, the principles of solution focused, and that truly, almost like a paradox, the less I've got an agenda for you, the more likely it is that the way I interact with you will result in you having an opportunity to explore what agenda you might have for yourself. Yeah, that.
Yeah, I mean, if I could add to that, to what Mark's just said, what I think is really important in those contexts is use of those active listening skills, really listening for clues and keys that might be helpful for the client or the organization to move forward. And then when they come up with difficulties and problems and regrets or whatever negative stuff they've experienced, is to really acknowledge that and validate it, and that sense of then being really heard by the person when you've got no particular agenda that you're trying to somehow force them into. That just opens up so much, and it then becomes far more client directed.
Janine?
So the question is, how do you embody it? I was just, yeah.
How do you take an SF stance into whatever problem-saturated environments you find yourself?
I mean, I'll take anything in an organization. So I worked with an organization for years, and the MD, he loved solutions focused. And the only thing he ever did, though, was go into a meeting and say, well, what does good look like? What's your miracle? And I have to say that just made such a difference. The rest of it was just beyond him, but he loved the idea. People smiling or giving a compliment, or just one small change systemically changes things. So to me, it's anything someone's doing, if they give someone a compliment, they have a better day. And equally, it's what works. Organizations are very pragmatic places, so getting people to tell stories, show results. Worked with a number of organizations where we've invited people to do projects, SF projects, and they present back. They've saved thousands off budgets. They've solved problems that were perceived to be unsolvable. They've got results that weren't expected, and sharing those examples, then people want to know how they're doing it and what's working, and then they find out that it's pleasant as well. That it was a pleasant way of working, and that we didn't have to blame each other after a failure. So to me, it's quick wins, anything that's useful, and also sharing those stories amongst people.
Yes. So we're short of time for this session. I want to ask each of you a question about another shifting across contexts or boundaries. We've talked about shift from therapy to coaching, to organizations and communities. In all of these, there's still been a practitioner and client or clients. There's a shift going on as well, I think, into SF as do-it-yourself, self-help. I've got some cards, I've read a book, I've got a poster on my wall. Does solution focus change if someone's just doing it for themselves and not doing it with any kind of expert or facilitator or coach or therapist? Brief thought from you each.
Okay, I'll share a thought. Somebody who inspired me almost more than anybody, I think, in my life was a psychiatric nurse who I learned a lot from up in Somerset 20 years ago, called Sam Roach. And he used to say, "How do I know what I think until I hear myself say it?" And so the value of articulating out loud in an interaction, I think, is huge. Having said that, yeah, I engage in solution-focused self-talk. Sometimes I catch myself not doing that, and when I catch myself, I'm then able to begin to do it much more productively. Yeah, well, that's it from me.
Thanks, Mark. John?
I don't think I've got anything to add there particularly. I think I'd endorse what Mark's just said, and I think it's important for it to become a part of our way of life, and it's our way of thinking. And what I've found with a lot of people I've worked with is that they embody the whole approach as well. And often I say to people on training courses, people we've worked with in terms of whether it's coaching or therapy, where we're using the solution-focused approach, they get it, they learn it, and they embody it, and it becomes a part of their life. So they don't come back to us with another problem, say, "Oh, can I see you again?" Because they've learned the tools and the techniques, and they've been re-educated, if you like, into looking in terms of solution rather than problem.
Thank you, John. Janine?
Yeah, I agree. I like the idea of articulating, and there is that interactional quality when someone is asking you a question and we're saying it out loud. But I got a message from a client or an ex-client this morning, and she said, "I woke up this morning and I thought of you. I was feeling a bit grumpy, so I asked myself, what does good look like?" And I'm having a better day. And so it's a blend, really. Once people have the tools, it's connecting with them. And some people are more self-sufficient and able to do so. Others need prompts and reach out or find it elsewhere.
Lovely. Thank you very much to all of the panelists, John, Mark, and Janine. And to those of you who are listening and watching, if there's anything that you feel you're taking away from the session, insight that you've had, something you've been reminded of, perhaps, or new question to explore, then please feel free to put that in the chat. And we've got 2 minutes before the next session starts. If you go back to your Padlet, you'll see that there's a variety of sessions beginning at 3:15, and we hope you choose wisely and enjoy wherever you go. And we'll see you back in the plenary room at 4:15 for SF6, Connecting Signs of Change in the World. This room will remain open for one of the sessions as well, the 4th Cognitive Revolution. So if you're staying for that, you don't need to change your Zoom room via the Padlet. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.